The morning of April 18, 1943, began not with the crash of gunfire or the roar of engines, but with the quiet heaviness of tropical air settling like a damp shroud over the Solomon Islands. Bougainville lay still beneath a mantle of heat, the jungle breathing out steam in waves so dense that it seemed the land itself was sweating. Above it all, at altitudes where the sky lost its softness and turned brittle and cold, a formation of American P-38 Lightnings sliced through the atmosphere. Inside one cockpit sat Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, a young man whose entire life had narrowed to the trembling of control surfaces beneath his hands and the relentless ticking of a fuel gauge that showed less than 20 minutes of endurance. His aircraft shivered, not from fear, for machines know nothing of such things, but from the strain of a mission pushed to the limits of engineering and human nerve alike. The P-38 was not a gentle plane. It was a brute of aluminum and rivets and turbo-supercharged engines, a creature designed not for elegance but for dominance, forced into the sky on the backs of factories that had learned to churn out death machines with conveyor belt precision. Its twin booms gleamed under the fading sun, and its propellers carved invisible spirals through thin air as though daring the sky to resist. Barber knew the aircraft intimately. He knew the rattle in its frame when the right engine throttled too hard, the pitch of the turbos when the plane dove into thicker oxygen. He knew the smell of heated metal and aviation fuel, the faint tang of machine oil that lingered in the cockpit like the scent of industry itself. The Lightning demanded respect, and in return it granted speed and firepower beyond anything he could have dreamed as a boy on the farmlands of Oregon. Below him, however, lay the theater of war that had consumed so many lives, the Solomon Islands, a chain of emerald stepping stones across a sea that glittered deceptively. The conflict here was relentless, unforgiving, and intimate. Soldiers fought in mud that swallowed boots and sanity. Pilots navigated monsoon storms that erased horizons. Disease stalked camps with military precision. And over it all hovered the specter of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, a strategist whose name carried both reverence and hatred in equal measure. He was not a caricature or a villain born of propaganda. He was a brilliant naval commander shaped by an empire that believed destiny could be engineered through discipline and sacrifice. And on this day, his fate was entwined with the humming engines of the American aircraft hunting him. In the months leading up to that morning, the world had already shifted. Japan's early victories across the Pacific, swift, decisive, almost mythic in their execution, had begun to lose momentum. Supply lines thinned, resources waned, and the Allies adapted. America's workshops, once engines of commerce, transformed into foundries of war. Entire towns became assembly lines where women and men forged weapons with practiced rhythm. Every rivet hammered into a wing, every cartridge packed into a crate, whispered the same truth: the sleeping giant had awakened, and it would not rest again until the balance of power was redrawn. Yamamoto had known this might happen. He had studied at Harvard, observed American industry, and warned his superiors of its potential. It is said he foresaw a war that would rage for 6 months to a year before the tide turned against Japan. Whether he uttered the poetic phrase about awakening a giant or whether history embroidered those words after the fact mattered little, the sentiment had proven prophetic. Now, as he traveled in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by skilled Zero pilots, he was unaware that the secret codes of his empire had been read by American cryptanalysts laboring in dimly lit rooms thousands of miles away. His schedule, once confidential, had become a roadmap to his death. Rex Barber and the 17 other Lightning pilots who accompanied him were briefed with meticulous detail. This mission was not a patrol, not a reconnaissance sweep, nor the chaotic dance of dogfighting that characterized so many aerial engagements. It was a calculated strike, an operation built on mathematics, timing, and secrecy. The P-38s would skim the ocean barely above wavetop height, hiding their approach from Japanese radar. They would climb only when necessary, intercept the bomber formation at a precise point, and deliver a decisive blow. The American leadership knew full well the implications. This was targeted killing, an assassination cloaked in the legitimacy of aerial combat. In another era, men might have questioned the ethics of such an act. But in 1943, with thousands of lives expended each week, ideals bent beneath the weight of necessity. For Barber, the mission was not about philosophical justification. He was 23 years old, barely older than boys still learning to shave. He had seen comrades vanish into the sea, consumed by fire, swallowed by jungles. In his mind were images of Pearl Harbor's burning ships, of families waiting for letters that would never arrive, of the immense machine of war grinding onward with or without his participation. If his bullet could shorten the conflict, if his gamble could weaken Japan's strategic command, then hesitation had no place in his cockpit. The P-38's engines droned like an industrial hymn, a deep mechanical chorus that vibrated in his spine. The oxygen mask pressed against his face, its rubber scent mingling with the sharp edge of adrenaline. He felt the air temperature drop as the lightning climbed, the cockpit canopy frosting at the edges. The horizon spread before him, a vast expanse where ocean met sky in a haze that erased boundaries. Somewhere ahead, perhaps only minutes away, were the Betty bomber and its escorts. Somewhere in that formation sat the man whose decisions had reshaped the Pacific War. As the Lightning Group neared their interception point, Barber's thoughts narrowed. He recalled training instructors barking commands, drilling into him the fundamentals of aerial combat: maintain energy, control altitude, preserve speed. He remembered tactics taught by pilots who had survived early engagements with the Zero: avoid turning fights, use dives to escape, rely on armor and heavy guns. Yet beneath that discipline simmered something else, something raw and human, the awareness that in mere moments, he might face a pilot whose name history might forget but whose skill could end Barber's existence long before the bomber fell. The American pilots maintained radio silence. Each knew his role. Each knew the risk. The distance they had traveled was punishing, fuel margins were razor-thin. A miscalculation could mean ditching in hostile waters, becoming prey not only to the ocean but to the Japanese search parties that would surely come. And yet the formation pressed on, unwavering, committed to the objective. 10 minutes of fuel. Then 9. The gauge seemed almost malicious in its honesty. Barber's hands tightened around the controls. The engines responded with a growl. The Lightning climbed slightly, positioning itself for the strike. He scanned the sky and then saw them, specks at first, then shapes, then unmistakable silhouettes of twin-engine Betty bombers flanked by Zeros whose graceful lines belied their lethality. The moment of engagement approached like a physical weight, pressing against Barber's chest, quickening his pulse. He inhaled deeply, exhaled, and fixed his gaze upon the formation ahead, knowing that the next minutes would determine not only the fate of a man but the symbolic heart of an empire. The instant the Japanese formation resolved into clear shapes against the sky, the world contracted into a space no wider than the gunsight before Rex Barber's eyes. Fear did not vanish, it compressed, hardened, refined itself into something sharp and useful. The two Betty bombers flew as expected, steady and level, while the Zero escorts orbited them with disciplined vigilance. Yamamoto's aircraft was there, somewhere in that mass of metal and motion, and Barber felt, with startling clarity, the weight of history settling onto his shoulders. The briefing had made it sound clinical: intercept, engage, neutralize. Yet there was nothing abstract about the sight of enemy aircraft glinting in sunlight, piloted by men whose skill had been honed in a crucible of conflict stretching back to China and beyond. These were not faceless enemies. They were professionals, believers, patriots of their own nation. And they would kill to protect the man in the lead bomber. Tom Lanphier broke formation first, peeling off with practiced aggression to begin his interception run. Barber followed seconds later, the Lightning trembling as he pushed the throttles forward. The distance closed rapidly. Tracers carved the air, faint streaks of fire that seemed almost delicate until they found their mark. The sky ceased to be a canvas of blue and became instead a vast arena of velocity and trajectory. The Betty bombers responded immediately, their gunners firing with desperate precision, while the Zero swooped down like hawks defending prey. The air thrummed with noise, the roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the metallic shriek of rounds slashing through air at impossible speeds. Barber saw Lanphier's burst connect, saw the first Betty shudder under the impact, smoke pouring from an engine. It dipped, then faltered, heading toward the jungle canopy below. But the second bomber, Yamamoto's, broke formation, its pilot yanking the controls to dive toward the treetops. The maneuver was swift, calculated, an instinctive reaction not of panic but of training. That pilot knew exactly what he carried. He knew that protecting the passenger in the rear cabin meant abandoning formation discipline and reaching the concealment the jungle might provide. The Zeros responded instantly. They plunged downward in pursuit, determined to shield the wounded bomber. Barber felt his throat tighten. This was the moment when training collided with reality. He needed to follow. He needed to commit. And he needed to do so with a fuel gauge that was rapidly turning betrayal into certainty. The lightning roared into the dive. The wings vibrated under the load. Airspeed climbed. The jungle rose to meet him in dizzying detail, patches of green, flashes of riverbanks, the shadows of palm trees. The maneuver was dangerous. A misjudgment would turn the P-38 into a projectile ending in fire. Yet the bomber remained in sight. The first Zero latched onto Barber's tail, its pilot a shadowy figure framed by cockpit glass. The Japanese fighter closed fast, turning with agility that defied logic. The Zero was a predator built for such moments, light, agile, ruthless. The Lightning could outclimb it, outdive it, overpower it, but in a turning fight, at low altitude, the Zero held supremacy. And for a few heartbeats, Barber found himself in a paradox. He needed to pursue the bomber, yet if he focused entirely on the chase, the Zero behind him would end his life before he got the chance. It was here, in these seconds, that Barber's most critical choice emerged. The Zero's traces passed close, too close, green lines that flickered by the canopy. His mind raced through options, dismissing them as quickly as they formed. A hard brake turn was suicide. He would bleed speed and become a stationary target. A climb was impossible. He lacked altitude and the Zero would shred him in the ascent. A dive toward the canopy risked collision, and even if he survived, the bomber would escape. He remembered, perhaps subconsciously, the training manuals. Preserve energy. Maintain speed. Never slow down in a dogfight. And it was precisely that rule he prepared to break. He throttled back. It was unthinkable. It was irrational. It was madness disguised as composure. The Lightning decelerated just enough for the Zero pilot to misinterpret the move as mechanical failure. Damage. Loss of power. Weakness. The Japanese pilot committed to the attack, tightening his turn, adjusting aim to deliver a killing burst at close range. Barber held his breath. He counted internally. 3 seconds. 2. He slammed the throttles forward, pushing them past military power into the realm of war emergency. The Lightning surged. The engines roared, the sudden acceleration pressing him against his seat. The Zero, committed to its turn radius, could not adapt in time. Barber broke free, rolling inverted, pulling through with an instinct and muscle memory born of endless hours of flight. And when he emerged from the maneuver, his gun sight filled with the silhouette of the fleeing bomber. He fired. The Lightning's gun spoke not as chaos, but as verdict. Heavy .50 caliber rounds and 20mm cannon shells tore into the bomber's right engine, igniting fuel. Fire blossomed, a brief, incandescent flare against the green backdrop below. The wing folded, and gravity claimed the plane with brutal indifference. It fell like an angel cast from heaven, trailing smoke that smudged the sky. Barber followed its descent with his eyes, watching as it vanished into the jungle canopy with a violent crash that sent birds scattering and left the air trembling. It was over in seconds. A life shaped by decades of service, ambition, doubt, and genius had ended in a remote jungle clearing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who had understood the stakes of war more clearly than most of his contemporaries, was dead. The symbolic heart of Japan's naval command had been extinguished by a pilot barely past the threshold of youth. The significance of the moment did not dawn on Barber immediately. Victory, in the cockpit, was a transient emotion. Survival still demanded attention. The Zero pilots, robbed of their charge, turned fury into ignition. They attacked with renewed vengeance, their aircraft somersaulting through the sky, determined to avenge the fallen. Barber's mind snapped back to calculation. His fuel situation was now catastrophic. The return journey was a gamble leaning toward impossibility. Yet he could not dwell on that. He climbed, weaved through the firefight. The lightning's strengths became lifelines, speed to escape, armor to absorb, firepower to deter. He did not seek kills now. He sought survival. The jungle below no longer appeared as an adversary, it was a reminder of what awaited should he fail to reach the open sea. The American formation fractured under pressure. Some pilots faced their own zeros. Others began the long and perilous retreat toward Henderson Field, their fuel charts a grim forecast. Barber glimpsed the ocean, a strip of blue framed by green, and angled toward it. The convoy pushed forward under a sky that churned with storm clouds and anticipation. The men aboard HMS Resolute and its escorts had been battered by days of suspense, but the thought of turning back never crossed their minds. Each sailor understood that courage was not merely an impulse, it was a commitment made long before they set sail. Every mile closer to Britain carried the weight of a kingdom depending on them. As they neared the most dangerous stretch of the sea, the weather turned from a drizzle to a relentless downpour. Waves collided violently, as though the ocean itself wished to swallow the ship's whole. The deck trembled. Visibility became a luxury. Thunder murmured across the horizon. Yet the convoy held formation, guided by instinct, training, and the belief that somewhere beyond the darkness lay a future worth fighting for. The engines roared, knives of rain slashed across steel, and the night tightened its grip. Below deck, Reynolds checked the engines over and over. The heat was suffocating. Steam hissed like serpents. He wiped sweat from his brow and tried to ignore the fear that tugged at the back of his mind. He had been confident before, but now the stakes felt unimaginably high. Every mechanical rattle seemed like a threat, every spark like a portent. He heard the distant thump of waves colliding with the hull and imagined the sea clawing to reach him. But he steadied himself. Instead of fear, he focused on each bolt, each piston, each valve. Machines, unlike war, made sense. Machines obeyed the laws of physics, not hatred. Up above, Commander Hale stood on the bridge, rain carving trails down his face, binoculars in hand. He saw shadows move through the mist. The uncertainty was crippling. A convoy without shelter was vulnerable to unseen enemies. He spoke not of fear, but of readiness, knowing every man around him sought direction in his silence. The night exploded with sound. A torpedo, unseen in the darkness, tore through the water and collided with a merchant vessel at the rear of the convoy. The blast thundered across the sea. Flames rose like infernal banners. The radio erupted with shouts. Hale barked orders instantly, his voice piercing through panic. Searchlights cut through the rain. Destroyers maneuvered with desperate speed. Men rushed to put out fires, flood compartments, and rescue survivors. The ship began to list. And yet, even with catastrophe unfolding, the convoy held course. Leaving one ship behind to save the rest was a terrible necessity, but none did so without anguish. They could hear cries across the waves that would haunt them for years. Fletcher, standing near the deck railing, felt his heart drop. War was no longer a distant narrative. It was agony in real time. He could smell smoke. He could hear men screaming for help. He clenched his fists. He would never forget that night. None of them would. Soon after, a submarine rose through the waves like a metallic beast, its conning tower cutting through the storm. As it prepared for another strike, one of the destroyers unleashed depth charges that thundered like divine wrath. The sea convulsed. The submarine was shaken, but it retaliated with fury. What followed was a deadly ballet of steel and strategy. The convoy was no longer prey fleeing a predator. It became an alliance of determination fighting for survival. Hours passed before the U-boat was driven off, disappearing beneath the waves like a wounded animal. But the damage had been done. A ship burned. Men were lost. And the ocean, greedy as ever, closed over the wreckage, leaving nothing but debris. Yet the convoy did not falter. They were scarred, but not broken. They regrouped. They counted their losses in silence. And they continued. As dawn approached, the sky softened. Colors of pale gold and blue painted the horizon. It was not peace, but it was hope. They could almost feel the shores of home calling to them. Hale allowed himself a moment of reflection. He wondered how many more convoys would be attacked. How many more ships would be sacrificed? How many young men would give their lives to protect a nation's heartbeat? He thought of the leaders guiding the war from distant offices and wondered if they grasped the cost. Soldiers were statistics on paper, but out here they were flesh and blood, dreams and memories, laughter and regrets. The world of strategy never captured the intimate brutality of sacrifice. On the deck, Fletcher approached Hale. They exchanged few words. None were necessary. Shared hardship had bound them together. The respect between officer and sailor had evolved into something deeper, a brotherhood forged not by choice, but by destiny. Meanwhile, beneath the turbulent surface of the sea, another submarine lurked, waiting, calculating. The convoy's final test approached. The submarine captain believed the previous attack had softened his prey. He prepared for a decisive strike. His crew moved with rehearsed precision. They were confident. They underestimated resolve. As the U-boat surfaced to adjust for an attack, it saw only the opportunity for a kill. It did not see the hidden destroyer lying in wait. This time, the hunters became the hunted. The destroyer's guns roared. The submarine was torn apart by relentless fire. Smoke and steel filled the air. The sea rolled over the wreckage with grim satisfaction. The convoy had survived because it refused to break. It refused to surrender. And the sailors aboard Resolute, exhausted but triumphant, understood the importance of what they had done. They had not merely protected supplies. They had safeguarded hope. When the convoy finally reached British shores, the battered ships limped into port. Civilians gathered to watch. They saw holes in hulls, scorch marks, exhausted faces, and tattered flags. And they understood. They saw courage not in parades or speeches, but in the arrival of vessels that should not have survived. Hale disembarked first. His posture was straight, but his eyes revealed the weight of what he had endured. He met with naval officials, provided reports, and answered questions. But nothing he could say would convey the magnitude of what had happened. Fletcher stepped onto land and looked at the coastline. He felt pride and sorrow intertwined. He knew that some of the men he had shared meals and conversations with now lay beneath the sea. News of the convoy's survival spread. It became a symbol of resistance. It proved that even in the darkest corridors of war, humanity could defy despair. But the victory was bittersweet. In a quiet cemetery overlooking the sea, families gathered to honor the fallen. A single bugle played. The wind carried the sound across gravestones and waves, as though saluting the courage of those who never returned. Hale attended, standing alone. He read each name carved into stone. Fletcher stood beside him. No words were spoken. None were needed. History records wars as movements of armies and decisions of leaders, but the truth is simpler and more profound. War is carried by individuals. Men who rise before dawn and sail into storms. Men who face fear and fight not for glory, but for duty. Men who return home with scars seen and unseen. And men who never return at all. In the years after the war, when peace finally emerged from the shadows, Commander Hale retired to a small coastal town. He kept his uniform hung in a wardrobe, untouched. Fletcher became a teacher, sharing lessons of courage with students who would never know the taste of war. Reynolds opened an engine shop, finding solace in machines that did not bleed or cry. And in moments of quiet, they would look at the sea and remember. The ocean remained the same. Vast. Relentless. Beautiful. Cruel. They understood that their journey had been more than survival. It had been a testament. A declaration. That even when darkness rules the world, even when storms rage, there will always be men who stand against it. Their story endured not because of medals or monuments, but because it embodied the essence of resilience. The convoy was no longer merely a mission. It had become a legacy. A reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it.